Maybe it happened slowly. A conversation that used to feel easy, suddenly feeling forced. Or maybe it happened all at once. A friendship, a relationship, even a family connection, ending in a way that still doesn't fully make sense to you. And in the middle of the hurt, there's a question you haven't said out loud to anyone. God, why did you let this happen? Why did you let someone I loved walk out of my life? Maybe you've spent nights replaying the ending, trying to figure out what you could have done differently. Maybe you still miss them, even knowing the relationship wasn't good for you. Maybe you feel guilty for the relief that sometimes creeps in underneath the grief, like you're not allowed to feel both at once. I want you to hear something before we go any further. Some people leave your life because you did something wrong. But some people leave your life because God is doing something right. And there's a story early in the Bible about two men who had to separate from each other. Not because of hatred, but because staying close was quietly keeping one of them from the future God had for him. Abraham and his nephew Lot traveled together for years. When God called Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a land he'd never seen, Lot went with him. They shared the journey, the uncertainty, the tents, the flocks, the whole unfamiliar road toward wherever God was leading them. There was real history there, real loyalty. Both of their households grew wealthy. They had so much livestock, so many servants, so much land they needed, that the ground literally couldn't support them staying together anymore. Their herdsmen started quarreling over water and grazing land. Tension that used to be small started showing up more and more often. And Abraham did something worth paying close attention to. He didn't wait for the conflict to destroy the relationship completely. He went to Lot and said, "Let's not have this quarrel between us, because we are family." Then he offered Lot the first choice of land, letting his nephew pick whichever direction he wanted, even though Abraham was the older man, the one God had actually made the promise to. Lot looked out at the plain of the Jordan, saw how green and well-watered it was, and chose it for himself. He moved his tents near a city called Sodom. Abraham stayed in the land of Canaan, and Scripture simply says they separated from each other. That's it. No dramatic fight, no explosive falling out, just a clear-eyed recognition that staying entangled together wasn't sustainable anymore, and a decision to separate with as much peace as the situation allowed. Here's what's easy to miss if you read that story quickly. Right after Abraham and Lot separated, God spoke to Abraham again, telling him to look in every direction, because all the land he could see would belong to his descendants. This is one of the clearest expansions of the promise God had made to Abraham. And it comes immediately after the separation from Lot, not before it. That timing isn't likely a coincidence. As long as Abraham and Lot were tangled together, sharing land, sharing resources, managing the tension between their households, Abraham's focus was divided. The separation cleared space, not just physically, but spiritually, for Abraham to hear God more clearly and step further into what God had for him. Lot's choice to settle near Sodom leads him into serious danger. He ends up living in a city so corrupt that God eventually destroys it, and Lot barely escapes with his life, losing almost everything in the process. Abraham, meanwhile, continues walking closely with God, building altars, receiving promises, growing into the man of faith we still read about today. This isn't a story about Lot being a villain. He wasn't. He was family, and Abraham never stopped loving him or caring what happened to him. Later, when Lot gets captured in a regional conflict, Abraham risks his own life to go rescue him. The love didn't end when the closeness did, but the closeness itself had to end for Abraham to become who God was calling him to be. Some relationships are exactly like this. The person isn't evil. They're not your enemy. But staying entangled with them keeps you tied to a version of your life that God is trying to lead you out of. Jesus talked about this same principle using an image that would have made complete sense to his original listeners, but might need a little explaining for us today. He described himself as the vine, and his followers as the branches, and he said that every branch that does bear fruit, his Father prunes, so that it will bear even more fruit. If you've never gardened, pruning can sound harsh. Why would you cut away something that's alive and growing? But anyone who has actually tended a vineyard knows the truth. A vine that's allowed to grow wild, sending energy into every branch and shoot without limit, actually produces less fruit, not more. The plant's resources get spread too thin. Pruning isn't punishment, it's focus. It's the deliberate removal of what's draining energy the plant needs somewhere else, so that what remains can grow stronger and produce more. This is precisely what happens when God removes certain people from your life. It's rarely because they were terrible people. Often it's because your energy, your attention, your emotional resources were being spread across a relationship that couldn't hold the weight of your growth, and God is redirecting that energy toward the fruit He actually wants to produce in you. That doesn't make the loss painless. Pruning still involves cutting. It still leaves a visible mark on the plant, but the purpose was never to harm the branch. The purpose was always more fruit. If you've ever lost a relationship, even one you knew wasn't healthy, and felt actual physical pain over it, you're not imagining that. Psychologists who study attachment have found that our brains process relational loss using some of the same neural pathways involved in physical pain. This is part of why a breakup, a friendship ending, or a family estrangement can leave you feeling almost like you've been physically injured. In a very real sense, you have been. Attachment theory teaches us that humans are wired from infancy to bond deeply with the people close to us. And those bonds create real neurological patterns, not just emotional ones. When those bonds break, even bonds that weren't good for you, your nervous system registers it as a genuine loss, sometimes even a threat to your survival, because that's how deeply your brain takes relational connection. This is why you can know, logically, that a relationship needed to end, and still feel the grief of it in your body for weeks or months afterward. Your mind understanding the reason doesn't automatically catch your nervous system up to the same conclusion. Give yourself permission to grieve the loss, even when you know the loss was necessary. That's not weakness. That's how deeply God designed you to connect with other people in the first place. Proverbs offers a simple but sobering observation. Walk with the wise and become wise, but the companion of fools suffers harm. This isn't about looking down on people or deciding who deserves your friendship based on how impressive they are. It's about something psychology has confirmed again and again. The people you spend the most time with shape your thinking, your habits, and even your emotional regulation more than almost anything else in your life. Researchers describe this through something called social contagion, the well-documented pattern where behaviors, moods, and even beliefs spread between people who spend regular time together, often without either person realizing it's happening. If you're consistently around people who catastrophize, who gossip, who pull you toward bitterness or fear or compromise, some of that will rub off on you over time, even if you never consciously decide to adopt it. And if you're around people who walk closely with God, who choose faith over fear, who handle conflict with grace, that shapes you too. This is part of what was happening with Abraham and Lot, even if it's not stated outright. Lot moved toward Sodom, a place defined by corruption. And, over time, that environment shaped him and his family in ways that led to real tragedy. Abraham moved toward continued closeness with God, and that environment shaped him into the father of faith we still look to today. Proximity isn't neutral. It forms you, one way or another. Here's something that might be hard to hear if you've been taught that love means unlimited access, no matter the cost to yourself. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. They're often what love actually requires. Abraham setting a boundary with Lot Choosing to separate rather than let the tension destroy them both wasn't a failure of love. It was, in some ways, an expression of it. He handled the separation with generosity, letting Lot choose first, and he stayed ready to help Lot later when he genuinely needed it. Boundaries and love were never in conflict in that story. The boundaries simply protected both of them from the slow erosion that unlimited closeness would have caused. Healthy boundaries are considered one of the clearest markers of emotional maturity. People without boundaries often struggle with anxiety, resentment, and burnout because they're carrying relational weight they were never meant to carry alone. Learning to set a boundary, even a painful one, even one that ends an important relationship, is often a sign of growth, not coldness. If God has been leading you to step back from someone, that doesn't mean you failed to love them enough. It might mean you're finally learning to love yourself and them in a way that's honest instead of self-destructive. If someone has recently left your life, or if you sense God nudging you to create distance from a relationship that's keeping you stuck, here's what this means practically. Let yourself grieve without rushing the process. Your body needs time to catch up to what your mind already understands. And that's not weakness. That's how you are made. Resist the urge to assign blame, either to yourself or to the other person, as the only explanation for what happened. Sometimes two people simply need different land, the way Abraham and Lot did, without either of them being the villain of the story. Pay attention to who you're walking closely with right now. Ask honestly whether those relationships are shaping you toward wisdom or pulling you somewhere you don't actually want to go. And trust that pruning, however painful it looks in the moment, was never designed to harm you. It was designed to make room for more fruit than the tangled, overcrowded version of your life could ever have produced. Abraham went on to become the father of nations, a man whose faith is still studied thousands of years later. That future required the separation from Lot. It required letting go of a relationship that, however loved, could not stay entangled with the path God had for him. Whatever separation you're grieving right now, whatever absence still aches when you think about it, consider the possibility that God isn't punishing you by removing that person. He might be pruning you, clearing space for a version of your life you can't fully picture yet. The same way Abraham couldn't picture the full extent of the promise until Lot's tents were no longer beside his own. The branch doesn't always understand the pruning while it's happening, but the fruit that comes afterward tells the truth about why it happened. If this spoke to you tonight, stay close and consider subscribing for what's coming next.